Just before we get to the video that you actually came here to watch, let me tell you about a new channel that I'm running called Decoding the Unknown. It's a show where I take a long, deep dive into some of the world's biggest mysteries, from what happened to the Roanoke colonists to the regular guy who found a listening device in his power strip. It's absolutely terrifying, and it's always a bit of a wild ride. You can find a link below. I hope to see you over there. BAZHYN is a 1,300-year-old isolated fortress surrounded by 10-meter-high walls in one of the most inaccessible areas of the Republic of Tuva in Siberia. Built on a small island in the center of Lake TARKHAN, high in the mountains, it's been cut off from all civilization and well preserved. Despite this, when, why, and how it was built has left scientists and archaeologists baffled for over 100 years. When Vladimir Putin visited in 2007, he left saying, "I have been to many places, I have seen many things, but I have never seen anything of the kind." It was first investigated by Russian geographer and ethnographer Dmitry Clements in 1891 and excavated in the 1950s and 60s by archaeologist Sevyan Weinstein. They were able to prove that it was built during the Ughur Khaganate period in the 8th century, but not much more than that. Despite the huge amount of work that had gone into such a massive project in this remote location, they were unable to uncover much of a cultural layer at all, meaning that it was never used. Before we get into the why it was built, the first mystery to solve is the how. It's a 7.5-acre site with more than 30 separate buildings, and it occupies almost a whole island in the middle of a lake. Just getting the materials across the water and finding enough space for the builders to work would have been challenging enough without the minus 45 degrees Celsius winters and plus 40 degrees Celsius summers. Local legend gave the first clue to solving this one, though. It said that in ancient times there was no lake surrounding the fortress, and a boy, Canacel, was born there with ears like a donkey. One morning, he saw water pouring from a well, and he was frightened and quickly fled to the mountains with one of his servants. When they turned and looked back, they saw a huge lake had appeared surrounding poor BAZHYN. It got its name, TARKHAN, when Khan got up, waved his hands towards the lake, and cried out in alarm, "Tahol, Tahol," and Tar in Mongolian means this, and Hol in Tuvan means lake. Scientists set out to investigate, and while the donkey years remain unproven and largely irrelevant to the story, the sudden filling of the lake is not as far-fetched as it sounds. A study of the area with satellites revealed that the water level has both increased and decreased over relatively short periods. It's almost completely disappeared on several occasions, most likely due to earthquakes cutting off or diverting the underground springs that feed it. At the time of poor BAZHYN's construction, the lake was severely depleted, and the fortress was built on a peninsula, not an island. So, why was it built? Well, let's start with what the archaeologists knew. In Tuvian, the name for poor BAZHYN means clay house, but with 30 buildings, it was clear it was much more than this. They also knew the rough date of construction, sometime in the 8th century, the time when the Ughurs ruled the region. Finally, the layout bore a striking resemblance to that of Urdubalik, the palace and capital of the Ughur Khaganate. The Ughur Khaganate was a Turkic empire that covered much of Central Asia between 744 and 840 AD. It began life as an alliance between the nomadic tribes of the area who'd spent centuries fighting for either control of the region or simply the right to live there freely. The Ughurs were just one of these tribes. However, through a seemingly endless list of alliances, both made and broken, victories over fellow tribes, and the destruction of the Turkish Khaganate in 744 AD, they came out on top and formed a kingdom, the Ughur Khaganate. So, to archaeologists, it was fairly clear that poor BAZHYN had been constructed by the Ughurs. But what no one could figure out was why. What could it have possibly been used for? Of course, there were theories, the three most plausible being a fortress, a palace, or a monastery. The volatility of the region and the sheer number of conflicts in Central Asia at the time led some to conclude that a fortress made the most sense, and in fairness, poor BAZHYN looks like a fortress. The rectangular-shaped construction covers almost the entirety of the islands, leaving the lake as a natural moat, and the outer walls are 10 meters high, with bastions and the remains of a wooden fighting platform. I mean, it just sort of screams defensive structure. However, there's a major flaw in this theory. It was built as a defensive structure, So what was there to defend? Seriously, I cannot emphasize enough how remote this place is. Initial hypotheses suggested that it could have acted as a guard post on the Great Silk Road between China and Europe. However, even the most noteworthy branches of the road were still about 1,000 kilometers south of Port BAZHYN. As with everything else, there were no military bases, valuable resources, or even a food warehouse anywhere near the site. So perhaps it wasn't built for war, but for peace. To get there, we have to look at what happens over the next couple of years in the Uyghur Khaganate. Following the destruction of the Turkish Khaganate, the leader of the Uyghurs, Kulig Boyla, took the title Kutluk Bilj Kol Khagan, glorious, wise, mighty Khagan, and claimed himself as the supreme ruler of all the tribes. He died just 3 years later in 747 AD, leaving the empire to his son, BAZHYN Khan. This began a period of rapid expansion and the golden age of the Uyghur Empire. BAZHYN Khan brought more tribes under the Uyghur rule and built strong alliances with the neighboring Chinese Tang dynasty. Most notably, he sent 4,000 horsemen to aid Emperor Suzong during the rebellion of 755 AD. They were used to retake the Chang'an and Luoyang and were handsomely rewarded. Not only did the Uyghur take home all of the silk that they could find in Luoyang after 3 days of post-battle looting, the Tang gifted them an additional 20,000 rolls, honorary titles, a fixed horse trade price of 40 rolls of silk per horse, and guest status when visiting Tang China. Their bond was strengthened with an exchange marriage. BAZHYN Khan married Emperor Suzong's daughter, Princess Ningguo, and BAZHYN's daughter, Princess Pijia, married Tang Dynasty Prince Li Chengkai. And what would you do once you've married a princess? Well, you build her a palace, of course, specifically one that would celebrate her Tang heritage and allow her to be comfortable. The striking similarity of the architecture of Port BAZHYN to the Chinese Tang-style buildings had already been noted by archaeologists. In particular, the northern curtain wall looked to have been constructed using the hang-to rammed earth method. This involved the construction of a temporary frame, adding a layer of earth, pounding it to condense it as much as possible, and then repeating until the wall was completed. Some ceilings were also constructed using the DOUGONG method, or the Chinese nailless ceiling technique. A series of brackets, dowels, and gongs were stacked and interlocked on top of the columns to support the weight of the roof. Port BAZHYN does, however, lack any form of heating system, and in a climate where winter temperatures can drop to -45 Celsius, it's unlikely to have been designed for year-round use. So maybe it was less of a palace and more of a summer house. This is given dubious weight by the fact that local residents claim the family and their warriors enjoyed resting on the island so much that on dark nights you can still see 8th century ghosts on horseback visiting their favorite rest house even after their deaths. Of course, there are a few holes in this theory too, beyond the fact that ghosts are being used as supporting evidence. Firstly, the architecture that was attributed to Tang culture has now been proven to be of a distinctly Uyghur style. Secondly, Princess Ningguo only ended up staying with the Uyghurs for 6 months in 758 AD, as BAZHYN died shortly after their marriage. This wouldn't have been enough time to complete the palace, and the princess didn't stay in it alone because the Uyghurs wanted her to be buried alive with her husband instead. The Tang understandably objected to that plan, and after some tense negotiations, she was allowed to leave. Neither fortress nor palace was a great fit, but without further evidence, it seems like a mystery that would be left unanswered. However, in 2012, FUSA MIYAKE, a cosmic ray physicist at Nagoya University in Japan, published findings in the journal Nature that would not only solve this mystery, but have the potential to solve other mysteries worldwide. Since the late 1940s and the work of Willard Libby, we've used radiocarbon dating to calculate the year of death of any organic material found. Carbon exists in the atmosphere in one of 3 forms, 12 and 13, which are stable, and 14, which is radioactive and therefore has a half-life. Carbon-14 is made when cosmic rays enter the Earth's atmosphere, producing neutrons that collide with nitrogen-14 atoms, creating carbon-14 and hydrogen. Plants and animals continually take in all 3 types of carbon through photosynthesis and their diets for as long as they're alive. This refreshes the carbon-14 atoms in their cells. However, when a living thing dies, it stops replacing its carbon, and the amount of radiocarbon in its tissues steadily declines. As we know the half-life of carbon-14 and that it decays at a constant rate, it's therefore possible to establish an estimated date of death by measuring the residual amount of radiocarbon left in the tissue when found thousands of years later. The only issue is it's not always that accurate. Sometimes only narrowing down down the time of death to within a decade or a century, which in most cases isn't too problematic. In the case of poor BAZHYN, though, it's vital. If the fortress was built before BAGA married the princess or after his death, a 1-year window, it couldn't be a palace made for her. Archaeologists needed to know the exact year of construction, and MIYAKE's work did just that. In the past, scientists believed that the amount of cosmic rays entering Earth's atmosphere and creating carbon-14 was fairly constant, varying between 1% and 2%. MIYAKE discovered this wasn't true. When studying the tree rings of a 1,800-year-old cedar, she found a surge in radiocarbon in 775 AD of 12% and in 994 AD of 9%, which can only have been caused by an intense burst of cosmic radiation. These events were named MIYAKE events after their discoverer and can be used to conduct what's called wiggle matching. This can determine the exact year a tree was cut and therefore the construction date of thousands of previously inaccurately dated buildings. For example, scientists have already used the events to establish the exact date of construction of a Swiss chapel, Holy Cross Chapel of the Convent of St. John the Baptist in Valmesterre, Switzerland. They've also conclusively proven that Vikings and not Christopher Columbus were the first Europeans to reach America. This precise dating, therefore, has the potential to adjust or completely rewrite huge portions of human history. But, well, what did it do for poor BAZHYN? In 2018, Russian scientists obtained samples of larch from the walls of the fortress with reliable bark layers and sent them to the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, one of the world's leaders in carbon dating. There they discovered the MIYAKE event in the third ring of the sample, providing conclusive evidence that construction began in the summer of 777 AD. The discovery meant that researchers had been basing all of their poor BAZHYN theories on the wrong kagan. BAGA died in 759 AD. Instead, they should have been looking at his son, Tengri Bogi Khan, the third kagan of the Uyghurs. After taking power in 759 AD, Tengri, who was about as up for a fight as his dad, didn't waste much time in planning to invade the Tang with 4,000 soldiers in 762 AD. However, following the negotiations, he joined them instead, and the Uyghurs helped once again in defeating the rebels at Luoyang and again looted the city. Unfortunately, he went one step further than his father and chased the fleeing citizens to the Buddhist temples they'd fled to and burned them down. 10,000 people were killed before the Tang paid them 100,000 pieces of silk to get them to leave. This period is significant because during the campaign, he met Manichaean priests who converted him to Manichaeism, a dualistic religion based on the cosmic struggle between good and evil, which Tengri soon declared the official religion of the Uyghur Khaganate. This supports the final theory for the reason of poor BAZHYN's construction, as a new official religion would surely warrant a new monastery. What it doesn't explain, however, is why it was left unused and abandoned just 2 days after it was built. To conclusively prove poor BAZHYN was built for religious purposes, this last question must be answered. And to do this, we need to know what happened next in the Uyghur Khaganate. In 779 AD, Tengri Bogi Khan decided once again to invade the Tang dynasty, this time under advice from the Manichaean clergy. His uncle, Tan Baga Tarkhan, disapproved of the religion and strongly opposed the plans. He tried to reason with Tengri. "The Tang is a great state, and it never betrayed us. Last year we invaded Taiwan and seized several tens of thousands of sheep and horses. We could count that a great victory, but because our way back was difficult and obstructed, by the time we reached our home, we were suffering from wounds, were tired, and almost exhausted. If we mobilize our forces again and do not gain a victory, how will we return at all?" His pleas were unsuccessful. While you might be thinking that this Ten Baga Tarkhan sounds like a pretty reasonable guy and his anti-war sentiments seem to set him apart from his violent family, you'd be wrong. When reason didn't work yet, Tengri killed along with 2,000 of his family members and followers and declared himself Kagan, fairly on brand. Once ruler, he began to suppress the Manichaean religion, proving the final piece of the puzzle for poor BAZHYN. Clearly, he'd have no need for a Manichaean monastery, and so it was abandoned, having never been used. He ruled for 10 years until his death in 789 AD, and Manichaean did eventually make a comeback as the official religion. However, by that time, the monastery had been hit by 2 earthquakes and a fire. Restoration would have seemed futile, as the potential for future earthquakes would have undone any work. In 2004, the government of Tuva announced plans for the development and preservation of culture in Tuva. They included poor BAZHYN in their program, and they aimed to restore the site and create a poor BAZHYN fortress park. However, geology is not on their side. More threatening than the earthquakes or fires, BAZHYN is built on a permafrost plug isolated in the center of the unfrozen lake. Each year, the edges of the permafrost thaw and the shores of the island erode. Geologists predict that it only has 150 more years before the outer walls collapse, marking the beginning of the end for the monastery.